new faces and old faces, I wanted to welcome you all today to the new session of Behind the Scenes. Today we have Emillie, who's coming with a fantastic presentation that Joao is going to delve much more into it. So thank you very much, Joao. The floor is yours.
No, very quickly here. Thank you again, everyone who's attending this call. So I'm just going to present Emillie. Of course, I know Emillie very well. Emillie, she is a PhD candidate at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. She's also a researcher at the University of Amsterdam's Open Intelligence Lab. And she's also a research consultant for the UN DPPA Innovation Cell. So Emillie's research lies on the formation of speech norms in social media content moderation and their impact in the formation of online counter spheres. With the UN DPPA Innovation Cell, she's developing analytical software and research methods for monitoring public conflict and dialogue processes across the web. And I think on a personal note, I would say Emillie is above all a brilliant and budding thinker of this field. And it's really a pleasure to have you today, Emillie. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Oh, well, thanks so much, João. Well, nice to see you all. So when I had to think of a topic for this presentation, of course, I think I had to sort of, realize or take a step back from the sort of really seismic changes I think that content moderation is undergoing at the moment. If we are to look at it at a landscape, I think we are almost looking at the sort of aftermath of a kind of earthquake and trying to sort of piece the pieces back together. And I guess if we are to find patterns within those pieces and in the commentaries that have emerged so far, and some of them have been from João and many of you, one of the commentaries, of course, or one of the diagnoses, if you will, is that there is a kind of a sort of return to the roots of content or of, let's say, platform governance, as it used to be perhaps in 2013 or earlier. And this is, in the very words of Mark Zuckerberg, and perhaps in the implicit words of other platform CEOs, the case. And through that idea, there's a sense that sort of content moderation is a sort of laissez-faire kind of operation again, that there is, in a sense, a lack of content moderation to be applied. And with that, of course, there are also very, very big changes that come with that. And I'm not going to delve in them, but I think that they're part of the menu here, which is that together with a change in content moderation itself, there's also fragmentation of platforms precisely by virtue of different or competing content moderation philosophies, right? So Blue Sky might have one and X another one, and that becomes in and of itself an engine for competition. And even beyond that, and perhaps this is the scariest part in a sense for most of us, is that those different philosophies also become a motive to compete with states in and of themselves, right? So X, for example, or Elon Musk presents itself as sort of the best model for democracy, sort of the best modeling or operationalization of democracy, and is in a sense more updated, quote unquote, than traditional democratic institutions, including the US itself. But perhaps in a sort of more less sort of sensationalized move, I would like to sort of step back and look into what's going on under the hood, actually. So these are all things that are happening around content moderation, but let's look back into the specific techniques of what is still there and what isn't there, and whether there are innovations or changes at all. And one of the things that comes to my mind is that, well, first of all, and this is sort of the Tarleton's old adage, right? That content moderation is a basic necessity for any platform to exist. Otherwise, there is no platform at all. And of course, that also extends to any and all public spheres in any and all histories of any and all forms of mankind or collectivity. But what's been changing in so far as content moderation is the techniques themselves. first, if we look at X in particular, and to that extent, perhaps also Facebook or Meta platforms, is that there is an investment in demotion, perhaps, as a way not to directly interfere in content that, you know, some users might or might not feel strongly about. And in addition to that, new techniques. And by techniques, I really mean the way that things function. So it's not just a little feature, but it's also the way that these are operationalized. And these are things like community notes that, unlike a lot of media reporting that tends to portray it as an invention by Elon Musk, actually emerged shortly after the January 6th riots of 2021. So that was still under Jack Dorsey's governance, if you will. And that technique emerged as sort of as a purported alternative, if you will. Today, its premise is that it should be an alternative to content moderation as a form of adjudication towards a form of consensus building. And of course, I'm going to go through that a little bit more. And what I mean by that is that it's kind of like a solution, and I put big quotes between that. And of course, I'm sort of using the language of the actor here, but maybe proportionally so, to content moderation as an impossible task. And that impossible task is the impossible task of demarcation, of having to demarcate norms, of having to say, this is not okay, that is okay. Where do you draw the line? What do we include between these lines? And how do we differ in our considerations about what to include in those lines and what those lines are, right? So in a sense, what I want to explore in this presentation is, what are these techniques? What is community notes, if you will, and what kind of family of techniques are they part of within content moderation arsenal? What issues are they trying to, again, solve with big quotes around them? To what extent are they representative of, let's say, the future state of content, social media content moderation? If there is an abandonment of adjudication, of let's say, removal, or these things that interfere too much into content? And what is there for researchers like us to recommend to content moderation governance if it means a shift to a logic of consensus building, in a sense, right? So what language should we speak if we talk about consensus building and not so much adjudication anymore? So before I get to introduce these techniques and also offer some ways to study them, first, I have to kind of step back and put myself in the foot of the actors that have introduced these techniques or developed these techniques. And then, in their perspective, content moderation is a really finite problem, and it does not work, basically. First, historically, from a historical point of view, the problem of deplatforming, which I remember Joe and Donovan mentioning 2010 was like, it was, you know, deplatforming just works. It works. Like, why are we not just focusing on the fact that it works? And I think it's fair to say today that we should really put a question mark into that. And not just from the perspective of social media, right? With the return of many actors that used to be deplatformed, but also from a historical perspective. I mean, there are just so many political actors that have returned from whatever firewalls or cordon sanitaire or any forms of content moderation, online or offline, in whatever political or social sphere you want, that have made a return to the mainstream, if you will, simply because of the sort of massively pluralistic environment in which we live online, right? That it's nearly impossible, I think, for it to contain anything. And of course, platforms themselves, and by that I mean X in particular, is or presents itself as a means to essentially implode these firewalls, implode any means of trying to contain all the sort of our worst impulses from history, as a means to liberate our sort of internal feelings and finally kind of liberate discussion through quote unquote common sense or sort of radical intuition. And the other problem that I mentioned beyond deplatforming is the problem of demarcation. So the problem of demarcation is, as I said, where do you draw the line? And what you see here, for example, is sort of a classic spectrum of content moderation from illegal to borderline content. And these are some lines that are drawn with a variety of content moderation techniques sprinkled within the spectrum from more or less acceptable. But indeed, how you draw the spectrum really entirely depends on relative to the norm that you want to implement, right? And those norms change based on across platforms as public spheres, if you will. So disagreement emerges on where you draw the line. And in a sense, what occurs is that additional conflict is introduced by content moderation in and of itself. So what are the solutions that have been introduced? And again, by solutions, I put big quotes around them. Attempts, perhaps. Well, one of them, of course, is demotion, with the idea that demotion affords normative flexibility, right? So if something is acceptable, normatively acceptable today, it's promoted. If something is normatively unacceptable tomorrow, it's demoted. Simply because from a technical perspective, if you detach yourself from participation within the norms and you observe these norms, you realize as a platform worker that, well, speech norms change all the time. Whatever people consider to be true or false or hate speech or whatever change all the time everywhere. And this is at this point something that platforms are fairly confident about admitting in their policies. And this is something that I think Facebook or Meta mentioned in their policy recently on misinformation. And so did YouTube. So the other attempt, and this is where I'm getting back at community notes, is what's called bridging systems. So bridging systems is a concept that emerged from this article over here by Aviv Ovadia and Luke Thornburg in 2023. But the work in and of itself already exists since 2016 or so, 2015. And essentially, it's kind of an attempt to think of systems within content moderation, if you will, that instead of adjudicating content can be designed to sort of connect to connect or bridge users across social, ideological, informational divides in a variety of ways. So it's based on first a goal, if you will, so which is to, as they quote, to increase mutual understanding and trust across divided users, creating spaces for productive conflict, deliberation, or cooperation. So this all sounds very nice and flowery. And what this means is that, technically speaking, it should be an improvement in relation metrics between users and content, users, and so on, that correspond to this goal over here, to bridge. And these should be things that are implemented in what they call attention allocators. An attention allocator is, let's say, a system online that tends to allocate particular sort of engagement and attention. So these can be recommender systems, it could be other ranking systems, it could be a news feed, it could be a sort of For You page, whatever you want. And that this attention allocator should be bridging to the extent that it causally supports this particular intuition over here. So I'm going to go through a number of examples here, because of course it all sounds very nice and well, but does it actually work and how is it implemented exactly? Well, one example, of course, is just public spaces for deliberation, right? And if you will, based on this terminology over here, a bridging environment or bridging system could be something like let's say a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as it happened in South Africa, where one directly involves multiple entrenched divides and tries to, with a variety of techniques or strategies, some more emotional, other more, let's say, procedural, find some sort of consensus, some form of compromise across these divided actors, historically and otherwise. In the case of a recommender system, if you will, that would be to try to promote content that is common across, let's say, political divides or any kind of divide that clusters users. So of course, there are multiple graph systems that try to cluster users in different ways. Some of them in collaborative filtering systems, for example, are interested in homophily. So a bridging system here is that you recommend things that all these users across all these clusters tend to like. So this would be the case over here, as opposed to the traditional case where for personalized feed, you only see things that you tend to like most, and the things that you dislike tend to be on the bottom of your feed. And then this is also implemented in what they call deliberation systems. This is a system called POLIS. So basically, it's been used by governments like Taiwan to facilitate deliberation about particular policies. In this case, it was something about, say, sweeteners or diet in a particular government. And what the system does is that there are a lot of users who vote for different ideas or proposals. In this case, it's the government must impose a sugar tax on whatever. And then one sees the groups that tend to vote similarly, as well as the potential commonalities amongst them. So it's a bridging system in the sense that it tries to actively look for cues or indications of consensus across groups. And the premise of these, let's say, this network over here of people that are interested in bridging systems and implementing them in platform content moderation is that it's a form of content moderation from the upstream, if you will. So if you reduce online conflict through quote unquote better design, then the production of harmful content, hateful language, misinformation, should decrease in and of itself. Because harmful content tends to be the product of conflict, right? So misinformation tends to be a product of misunderstandings, hateful language a product of a radically escalated conflict, and so on. And that in and of itself should reduce the cost of content moderation and prevent additional conflict due to content moderation decisions in and of itself, right? So by that I mean adjudication. And so who are these actors? Well, these are academics and NGOs that are primarily working in the center of sort of tech or civic tech or conflict mediation and all these initiatives called AI for democracy, platform design, and so on. And they themselves are particularly in touch with tech workers or platform departments that are sort of interested in, quote unquote, improving the health of online debate. This used to be a sort of a Twitter initiative of late 2021. For developing content moderation, and there are a number of state actors who sort of host these initiatives for the above. Within those plans, right, to develop content moderation and such, there is, and this is not very well reported, but don't quote me on this. I'm not sure if this is going to be public, but so you know, there have been emails exchanged where some platform workers, I'm not going to quote who exactly here, but it's someone who is responsible for developing community notes on Twitter, on X, was very excited about applying sort of community-like mechanisms to the rest of the platform, so to expand these techniques throughout the platform. And Blue Sky and Mastodon are seen as sort of like new virgin lands, if you will, for experimentation of this kind and partnerships between these actors and these actors. And all of this together is kind of seen as let's say, an effort to decentralize content moderation governance within a broader middleware market, if you will. So this is where people can introduce specific techniques, sort of, let's say, I don't know, recommendation packages, things like that, that you can then just plug into a platform and then make it work however you want. And this is kind of seen as a solution to implement these alternative platform design mechanisms. Okay, so coming back to community nodes, how exactly can one consider it a bridging technique, if you will? Well, first, I think I'm going to jump to the point in case, because it calls itself a bridging algorithm, at least when it was launched. And it quoted directly the paper that I mentioned before that introduced the concept of bridging algorithm. And the community nodes was introduced shortly after the January 6 riots, and it was kind of, it was part of the context. I think perhaps, again, there wasn't a lot of attention in that, but the language of it was very kind of, you know, sort of the health of public debate. This was kind of the language that it used, or diversity of perspectives and so on. So it was sort of trying to sort of figure out and go beyond content moderation as a finite problem, because obviously it had not been able to contain such a catastrophe as it happened in the US and eventually in other places in the world. So how does it work? Well, first, the user enrolls in content in community nodes, and then they just see lots of posts that need more ratings, and then they decide if the existing ratings are helpful or not helpful. So they have to, like in a survey-like system, they have to check either one of these boxes. If they find it helpful, they can say, oh, it's easy to understand or provides important context, whatever. And then their rating is then combined with that of other users. And so these should be diverse clusters of users that have different rating preferences. And if their rating plus that of a diverse, as diverse possible enough clusters of users also find it helpful, then the result is that it's a helpful community notes. If they disagree, if there is no consensus across these groups in their rating, then it's not helpful. Or if it's still, sorry, no, my mistake. If they all agree that it's not helpful, then it's not helpful. But if there is no consensus, right, across these groups and the new input, then there are not enough ratings. Or there are not enough ratings if there are just not enough ratings quantitatively, right? Okay. So how does one study all of this then? Well, okay. So this was a project that I finished recently, and my attempt here was to study community notes on Twitter, specifically Dutch-speaking Twitter, just because the Netherlands is so tiny that it makes a good sort of finite data set that I can work with. Because if I were to look at the US, I think my computer would implode. Okay, but so in order to understand community notes, first, what I wanted to do was to contextualize sort of, let's say, the platform, sort of the content moderation history in which community notes emerged. So first I sort of did the classic platform governance archives research, where I got my policies from the Wayback Machine and partly from the archive as well. Then I looked into their overall changes, and then I also read the changes. For community notes itself, one can get them from X. It bears without saying that actually, of all the things that Elon Musk retained after Jack Dorsey, was community notes itself. So everything else imploded, but that is the one of the only things that he left. And he says himself that it's one of his favorite features for some reason. So the platform makes that data available online, and you can just download it. And from there, I filtered everything that wasn't in Dutch. And then the important thing here, which is the more sort of tricky thing also for all of us, is to scrape the thing that the information that the community notes don't contain. And these are tweets themselves. So I did that just so I could get an idea as to what the community notes were about and who they were for, right? So who had posted the tweets that were community noted, and what were those posts about? So I scraped all the tweets, and then I classified them in a variety of ways that I will explain. And then just because I was interested in demotion and deletion, I also got search results for a period of time for a number of tweets about topics about an extremely contentious issue in the Netherlands at the moment, and bears without saying the rest of Europe, if you will, which is migration. So I wanted to see whether X was effectively demoting the tweets that were more or less hateful. And by hateful, I mean classified by OpenAI's moderation API. And I'll show the results in a bit. So first, this was just to get a very broad look at content moderation changes in the policies quantitatively from Twitter to X. So these are all the policies here, from authenticity all the way to privacy. And the size of the dots here is the number of words that have changed from one instance to another per policy. We don't have to delve into this a lot, except to say that essentially what one notices through this more distant reading is just periods of, let's say, content moderation regimes, if you will. So here there is one that is more or less consistent, which is after the Musk takeover. And here there's another one between around, let's say, 2019 and 2022, of not significant changes. And before there are other ones. Of course, one needs to do close reading to confirm those. But what I wanted to end up with was kind of a sense of how was the content moderation regime shortly before Musk and after Musk, and where do community notes and demotion fit into that? So what you're seeing here in this sort of circle is essentially it's a compression of all the policies that were active in between this time around 2020 till 2022 before Musk takeover. where every segment here is a policy, and the color here is the enforcement method. And the idea of putting it in this big circle is kind of to sort of envision or imagine Twitter or X, if you will, as a sphere, as a public sphere, if you will, that has its own sort of finite delimitations that are imposed by policies. And what notices with these colors is essentially that for all of these different policies, and I should mention that with every sort of circle here is a different enforcement measure. So this is the first applicable enforcement measure for a given policy. So for example, hateful conduct first applies deletion and then asks to remove tweets. And then if that doesn't work, then it applies suspension and then permanent suspension and so on and so forth, right? So these are all the sort of the measures before one reaches the end of the policy line. One sees that, well, sort of the predominant color here is definitely permanent suspension. So there are very strong measures against, and by strong, I don't mean in effect, but it's very sort of clear measures for the enforcement of every one of these policies. And one could already see by then that what was sort of creeping in was demotion, really, as something that was applied particularly for synthetic and manipulated media or abusive behavior as well, or world leaders, or COVID. And this is what it looks like with Elon Musk. Okay, so it's a bit strange because there are no second measures except for election integrity and adult content. It's a bit hard to read as well because it looks a bit like a rainbow, but I'll explain it in detail. So again, these are all the policies that are sort of comparable to this image here. And what one sees is in the blue shades over here, it's demotion. So these are all measures that consist in reducing reach of content. So now this is the primary method for abusive behavior, for election integrity and hateful content, and to a certain extent authenticity. And the only strong measures really for removal and suspension are applied to adult content and child safety here that I could see. And for the rest, all around it applies community notes. So this is essentially kind of like, if you will, maybe the end of the policy line for certain cases. So demotion and community notes are the primary sort of means of content moderation here, except for very extreme cases in child safety and adult content. Okay, so I wanted to check demotion really, really quickly, and it's not the priority of the presentation, but just because João told me there's an interest in methods, I just wanted to show you a possibility to look at this. So again, these are tweets for every day, right? So these are search results that one finds when one searches for every one of these queries here in Dutch. So this is refugee, migrant crisis, migration, everything that has to do with migration. This is the average ranking of each one of these tweets per day. The ranking is here this is the first tweet you're going to see in your search results when you look for all of these queries, and this is the last one you're going to see. And what the color represents in red, so the red of the circle is the position in relation to immigration. So red is against immigration and blue is neutral. But what's more interesting here is the thing around it here. So this is the hate score. So this was the closest thing that I could get to Twitter's own hate speech detector, which is called Sprinkler, I think. And it was by using the OpenAI moderation API. And what it does is that it assigns a score as to how likely something is to be hate speech. So what one can see is that the sort of the quote unquote hateful posts, there was one on average that tends to be on top, but the impressions or the views are relatively low. And for the rest, they are effectively more so on the bottom. So the redder the aria here is, the more, let's say, the higher the hate speech score. So this is one, and these are other. So for the rest, they're all sort of midway there, right? And I guess the finding here is that, well, yeah, I mean, everything here is against immigration. So hate speech is just a component of that. It's just part of the spectrum. So yeah, content moderation doesn't, I mean, demotion doesn't necessarily make sense when it comes to this. Not very well, at least. Now, looking to community notes, I will explain the spaghetti monster. So basically, this is an alluvial diagram that represents who gets community noted in the Dutch community note sphere. So these are percentages for a total of around 6,000 tweets in Dutch. And there are 3 qualifications for every community notes. So there is currently rated helpful, then not helpful, and needs more ratings, right? And these are the people that are being community noted, and this is the things that they're talking about. So what one sees immediately is that a lot of so-called alternative influencers, I'm taking the terminology from back in 2016, so these are people who are interested in conspiracy theories and so on. A lot of them tend to get a lot of community notes. And then there are a lot of far-right or right-wing politicians. That's a majority, at least, in comparison to center-left politicians. A lot of journalists are community noted, fact-checkers, columnists, commentators. A lot of new media and broadcasters are community noted. And then academics as well, activists. And then another majority is here, private users. So in a sense, okay, this kind of gives you sort of like a sanity check. It's like, oh, it's interesting, you know, a lot of conspiracy theories are being community noted. That, you know, that's something, let's say, that I think a lot of us are gonna sort of, you know, feel is working relatively well. Of course, we might disagree, but yeah. Now, the problem is when one looks into what gets community noted and the extent to which there effectively is consensus in community notes for certain topics. So the top topics that are community noted in the Dutch sphere are the following. So history and historical conflicts, specifically the Gaza-Israel war, Ukraine or Russia or Putin, anything to do with the Ukraine war, or tensions arising from the Gaza war. So, for example, allegations of anti-Semitism, concerns about genocide, and so on. The second one is Dutch politics, of course. And then the third one is migration. So these are tensions arising from immigration, or even sort of demographic replacement theories. Various social controversies like critique of identity politics, so-called wokeness, and so on. Or energy and climate change. And this is significant in the Dutch public debate because of the nitrogen crisis, because of the farmer crisis. So what does this show? I think on first look, it shows that, well, the topics that are difficult to get consensus for, there is significant disagreement around Gaza, Israel, around tensions arising from the Gaza war, are naturally those things that needs more ratings the most. So it's difficult to get consensus. It's difficult for community noters to agree on topics about this. And it's difficult for community noters to agree on migration, or to agree on this, or to agree on Dutch politics. So community notes only really works, if you will, when it comes to things like, let's say, factualities. So conspiracies, for example, have a great deal of community notes that are rated helpful. So they're just disproven, for example. For example is maybe, yeah, very clear things. But for the rest, they just need a lot more ratings, which means that community noters are not getting a lot of consensus, and one reaches a problem of intractability, if you will, of something that cannot be resolved through consensus. And maybe if we look at LLMs, of course, because all the discussion about LLMs at the moment is perhaps one can say the same, in the sense that, let's say, LLMs will tend to be very polite when confronted about, you know, controversial topics. They'll navigate between being very agnostic, trying not to take a position, all the way to just refusing to answer something altogether. And on the way there, it will use a number of different, let's say, discursive techniques, like being diplomatic. You know, some people say X, others say Y, or academic. Oh, this is a very complex question. There are a few ways to understand it, and so on. But the problem here is also the problem of plurivocality, right? Is how exactly do you allow different voices to participate or to speak through the debates that they participate in your training data when you ask for a controversial question. And in a sense, that also reaches a problem of intractability. It is how exactly are you going to model some sort of consensus or reconciliation across those voices when it comes to aggregating data into text generation. So in a sense, the problem of intractability, which is one that we find in community notes or bridging systems, is in a sense, sort of returns to a problem of moderation. And what I mean by that is, well, at the end of the day, there needs to be some sort of decision. You know, do we talk about this or do we not? What are we going to say about, migration or, the war in Gaza? Where do we agree here? So there can be a lot of stimulation for consensus building, but at some point that also becomes a final thing. And I think this is where moderation returns, if you will. So how to make sense of this, and I'm already reaching the end of the presentation, that I think that for us, for people that study moderation, it's interesting to really remember, always go back to the etymology of things. And then moderation is, amongst other things, it's about reducing extremes relative to a norm, whatever that norm is, right? So this is the historical work of moderation, to reduce political behavioral excesses while reinforcing that norm. But a moderator or a moderation setting is also something that means the facilitation of dialogue. Someone that plays the moderator in the debate is someone who is interested in making the dialogue go on, retain itself, and if you will, sort of stimulate itself. So in that sense, I think this second meaning here ties back into what I call these bridging systems. And I think, in a sense, because of the problem of deplatforming, of the absolute sort of the limitations and the finite aspect of content moderation, the fact that one cannot contain, or can contain really to a very limited extent, those voices that we don't want to have present in a public debate, maintaining consensus or facilitation of dialogue about the norms that we want to reinforce is crucial for moderation to retain its legitimacy, or to survive, if you will. So in a sense, I think these two meanings here should be considered. And I think that us as researchers could also very well focus on the second one here, in order to reinforce the first one. So in terms of potential research agendas, I think, and these are all questions, right? We can ask ourselves, when we think about consensus building platform mechanisms, whatever it is that we think of this, and of course, we're all academics, so we love to be skeptical and really bitch about platforms all day. But can we actually think of ways to foster consensus about content moderation itself? And how do we do that? And of course, we can also, one another point of focus is how do bridging content moderations really translate ideas of consensus, deliberation, or other sort of political conventions, as long and as rich as they are, right, into technical systems. So here there is a lot of critical thinking that could be added to this question. Another question is, how can state and other actors participate in the design of such systems? So as I said, bridging systems are just like, it's the history of humankind, right? I mean, we do bridging any day, all day, all the time, with our wives, with our whatever it is, with our pets. So how exactly can more traditional actors, particularly those that have nurtured these systems, right? Parliamentary deliberation is one of them. How can they implement or operationalize their conventions into these systems? How can they be part of this conversation? And then I go back to the problem of intractability as well. What do we do? Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.